The second stage of the French Revolution is known as the Radical period. It is also known as the Reign of Terror. It is the period where it is a republic, but a republic of virtue, and run predominantly by Robespierre. It's captured the imagination of many in literature and in history. But it is actually a very short period, but we'll look at that in this video and then touch upon the Thermidorian reaction that results from that radical period. The radical period comes, to put it in context, because of the actions of the king in the constitutional or liberal stage of the revolution. The king was officially part of the government, though his power was limited, and not liking that limited power and fearing in some sense for his life, if not at least his crown, King Louis XVI flees. He tries to get to the border of France. He is captured by the revolutionary forces. You see that depicted here with the king and queen dressed as bourgeoisie, but the revolutionaries finding them anyway, coming to bring them back to Paris. Once they come to Paris, they are attacked by a violent mob in their palace of Tuileries in August 10th, 1792. To clarify, this is the palace in the middle of Paris, not the Palace of Versailles. When the commoners march on the palace and take it over, the royal family flee to the National Assembly for protection. The National Assembly grants it, but only a couple months later, on September 21st, so not even a full couple months later, the National Assembly is forced by popular demand to eradicate the monarchy. This, in many ways, allows for an establishment of something totally new in the form of a republic, because now they don't even have a king tying them to the past absolute monarchy. What will proceed is two questions: a question of who should then have power and how that power should be set up, as well as what to do with the king. The first question is a difficult one because from the very beginning, the factions, the Republican leaders, were divided. There were the Girondinists, who I'm mispronouncing, and they were more laissez-faire. They were more interested in a freedom from the government and allowing that to progress somewhat independently. And they were countered by the Jacobins, who are a much more radical and almost militant group, who were joined by the Paris militants known as the sans-culottes. And the sans-culottes means without breeches, literally. Breeches are the capri-like leggings that men would wear back in the Revolution. You see that depicted here by the drummer. He's wearing where the pants end right after his knee, and then his socks start. That would be his stockings. That was the older style. The sans-culottes are depicted by the man on the left. They are full-length pants. They were more loose and demonstrated the working man. This group of men join up with the Jacobins, and women too, join with the Jacobins to try to make something completely new in Paris. The problem is that there's this power vacuum now that the king is out of power, and that means the entire constitution needs to be rewritten. And in the midst of that are some more sinister moments for the Jacobins, which are going to come back to haunt them later. The main one is the September Massacre, in which thousands of prisoners are pulled out of the prisons and executed with just mere formalities of trials because of paranoia that some of them might support anti-revolutionary activity. The blame for this is going to land on Georges Danton, who is located in the lower left-hand corner, and then right above him also by Jean-Paul Marat, who is spelled M-A-R-A-T. And these two, being Jacobins and these revolutionaries, will take the blame and ultimately will result in both of their deaths. Georges Danton is killed at the guillotine in the last few months of the Reign of Terror. Jean-Paul Marat is killed by a Girondin woman, Charlotte Corday, while he's actually taking a bath. And this is depicted here by Jacques-Louis David as a martyr here of the revolution. You can see minimal reference to his murder. Simply, here he is dying, writing the words of the revolution. The other question was, of course, what to do with the king. And after a fiercely contested issue on January 21st, 1793, the Republic decided that he should be executed. And take a moment to look at this picture because it is poignant in terms of the symbolism that is happening. The revolutionaries had set up the guillotine, a new scientific, fast and speedy way of executing people. They had set it up in the center of the square. It's called the Place de la Corde. Opposite it, notice this kind of abandoned pedestal that you see in the right-hand side. This was where the statue of Louis XV would have been, but it had been torn down along with many other royal symbols within Paris. And it's no mistake that the guillotine is set up opposite and becomes the physical removal of anyone connected to the king, even though you have this symbolic removal already having occurred. Once the king is dead and his wife is executed later that year in October, the revolution now focuses on other things. And it's important to remember that this revolution and the radical period is overshadowed by many of the events occurring internationally. And that is because during this entire period, France is at war. Earlier in 1792, the Assembly had declared war against Austria. Since then, Britain, the Piedmont regions, which are northern Italy, Spain, and the Prussia had joined in to fight against France. This was a problem. Look at the map. Britain being north, Spain being south, Piedmont being to the southeastern area. Of course, then you have Prussia and Austria making up what used to be the Holy Roman Empire on the other side of France. So France is surrounded. But France actually did pretty well. While their army was relatively disorganized in the first few years of the revolution, they were able to organize themselves pretty quickly during this radical period, thanks to men such as Kellerman, who you see sketched out here again by David in 1792. He begins to push forward, and by 1793 and 94, the army successfully takes back multiple areas of land around the border of France, pushing back many of their enemies. So much so that by the early 1794, they had brought many of their enemies, particularly Spain, Prussia, and Piedmont, to the bargaining table to discuss terms of surrender. But that doesn't happen in a day. And in order to fight a war, you need men. And so the French Assembly passed the levée en masse, which is the first law of conscription under the Republican government. And here's the first, printed here is the first words of the law that is passed by the Assembly. And they basically call all Frenchmen, whether they be young men going to battle, married men forging arms, women making tents, clothing, and serving in hospitals, or children turning old linen into lint, aged betaking themselves to the public places to preach courage and hatred of kings. That it is to involve the entire republic in this fight for freedom against external enemies. But this is also going to take an internal turn. It's saying everyone needs to be involved. Everyone needs to be committed to this civic virtue and this determination to establish a republic. And that takes a very sinister turn in the same years as the levée en masse is being implemented in what we know as the Reign of Terror. It begins with the purge of the Girondins. The levée en masse caused many of the poor people in the outskirts of France and the countryside to revolt against the National Assembly. They were becoming skeptical that any government could do anything differently, and so they revolt. This revolt is put down, but it does lead and allow some of the radicals within the National Assembly, which is becoming, the National Convention at this point, that they start to have reason to suspect others of anti-revolutionary activity. As a result, they kill many people at the guillotine over the course of this year and a half. Some of the numbers include 2,000 killed at Leon, multiple priests, and 6 different drownings at Nantes, 300,000 arrested, 17,000 of those executed, and probably 10,000 of those also just died in prison. The Reign of Terror, therefore, cost many people lives, and in many ways, therefore, freedom as well, questioning and causing people to question whether the foundation of the revolution had gone off track.